My name is Elena Tracy, and I represent WWF Global Arctic Programme, and I will be moderating this event today. But before I turn to our lovely presenters online and also here in presence with us, I would like just to say a few words to set the scene and to recap. The Arctic is an important ice habitat for wildlife. Its unique ecosystems supporting a huge productivity of plant and animal life in the ocean. It is also a home for Inuit people and for other indigenous communities. The Arctic region is a major climate regulator and is now considered to be warming 4 times faster than the planet as a whole. We are experiencing unprecedented seasonal ice loss in the Arctic. Permafrost is thawing. The temperatures in the oceans are increasing. Receding sea ice has also increased in interest among shipping companies and shipping industries to sail in the Arctic waters. According to the Arctic Council, there has been a 25% increase in Arctic shipping between the year of 2013 and 2019, and a 75% increase in the total distance traveled by all types of vessels. Those increases in Arctic shipping are also driving increases in black carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, which are contributing to the climate crisis. So black carbon, and you are going to hear a lot about this today, is a short-lived climate pollutant produced by incomplete burning of fossil fuels, with the impact over 3,000 times that of carbon dioxide on a 20-year global potential basis. It's responsible for about 1/5 of the international shipping emissions. And when released near to the Arctic, it has a disproportionate impact on the ecosystems and the people's health. Not only does it contribute to warming, while in the atmosphere, it accelerates melting if settled into snow and ice. The melting leaves darker areas inland in water, which used to be covered by snow and ice. Those dark patches severely reduce the reflective capacity of the planet's polar ice caps, which is known as the loss of the albedo effect. Black carbon also has a negative impact on human health, and you're going to hear a lot about this today. Yes, and I'm happy to see our last presenter is coming. The need to reduce emission of black carbon because of its impact on health and climate has been addressed for a long time. On land, dirtier fuels were banned in the use in power stations, and diesel particulate filters were installed in land-based transportation. At sea, however, those measures have not been taken yet. Reducing black carbon isn't difficult. It doesn't require the invention of new fuels or new technologies. And if the measures are taken now, the effect will be immediate. Now I would like to turn to our lovely speakers here. And I will probably I will list them in the order of their presentation. So we are joined today by Shilpa Rao-Skirbekk from the Norwegian Institute of Public Health. She also represents AMAP, the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, and the EU-funded project called Arctic Black Carbon Impacting Climate and Air Pollution. We also have here, pleased to have Lisa Koperqualuk, the Vice President of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. We will have Lyudmila Osipova, representing International Council on Clean Transportation, and she will join us online. Elisa Mameneses from Say No to LNG campaign is here with us in person. And Panganga Panguwiwi from the Indigenous Environmental Network is also here with us. And the last but not the least, we will be joined by lead advisor of the Clean Arctic Alliance, Sean Prime. So let's, without further ado, I welcome our first speaker, Shilpa Rao-Skirbekk.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to this session. I am not a shipping expert, but as was introduced, I represent the AMAP and the ABC-iCAP project. And both of these have a focus on BC and methane, on black carbon and methane. So while I'm not going to exclusively be talking about black carbon from shipping, the idea is to give you an overview presentation of how black carbon and methane affect your health. And maybe I will show you one slide on shipping-related climate impacts. We're still not there with calculating the health impacts related to shipping because of the uncertainty in these emissions, but I will give you a kind of broader overview. So what are SLCFs? SLCFs are short-lived climate forces. They have a shorter lifetimes in the atmosphere, and many of them are also air pollutants. And they result from a set of different activities. So in the Arctic, especially flaring is important, and that's also an important source of black carbon, oil and gas activities, diesel engines, shipping, of course, and the use of fossil fuels and domestic heating are also important issues. As you can see on the left side, the main pollutants that we concentrate on are black carbon, BC, and ozone. Ozone is a precursor. Methane is a precursor for ozone emissions. So BC and methane are what we focus on. And both BC and ozone, which is produced through methane, both have very large impacts on our health, on our cardiorespiratory health in particular. Air pollution is important in the Arctic region, but it's also important globally, as you're well aware. You can see the pollution pods outside to show you that pollution is still a leading issue in many parts of the world. Air pollution is the fifth leading global health risk factor, and it's also for the Arctic regions and the Arctic Council regions. It's one of the most important factors, environmental factors that affects their health. And you can see that BC and ozone also have other kinds of impacts. So I'm going to mainly talk about the health impacts, but they also have impacts on crops. So you have crop yield decreases, and of course they have climate impacts. So both BC and methane have been associated with quite significant climate impacts. And while my focus today will not be on the climate impacts, you should keep that also in mind. How do we do our analysis in AMAP and the ABC-iCAP? We basically produce scenarios, and the scenarios help us to look at the future and how these emissions evolve in the future. And we do energy scenarios primarily. So we look at energy scenarios from the IEA World Energy Outlook, and these are the scenarios that are the basis for what we do. We took two scenarios from the IEA World Energy Outlook, the new policy scenario and the sustainable development scenario. The new policy scenario is basically a business as usual scenario. So we continue as we have been doing the same kinds of legislations, climate and air pollution as we have now. And the sustainable development scenario, as you can see on the right side, is a more dramatic. I have a pointer. Yeah. I can't manage to make it focus, but you can see that the STS scenario is the bottom line, and that goes really down with the carbon emissions. So it's kind of a dramatic scenario being talked about also in the COP on how you can reduce fossil fuels to phase them out. And we look at two kinds of air quality legislations, currently agreed climate and air quality legislations, and we include the MFR assumptions with the STS. MFR is basically a scenario that includes ambitious air quality targets and assumes a full implementation of technically feasible SLCF emission reduction technologies. So the MFR STS is kind of an extreme scenario. It assumes a phase out of fossil fuels and assumes also a phase out of air pollution. And I won't go into much detail in this figure, but you can see here the emission reductions across all sectors. So you can see here that for the Arctic Council and member countries, we have the different kinds of sources, so agricultural waste burning all the way up to waste. And you can see that the CLE scenario already, because CLE scenario is quite a few legislations already in place in Europe. And you can see that already in the CLE scenario, which is basically the first bars here, you can see that there's a significant reduction in many, many sources of emissions, but not in all of them. So you can see that some sources still continue to emit, maybe because CLE legislations are not stringent enough. And then if you have the MFR on top of it, you can see that MFR produces a huge impact, for example, on industry-related emissions and so on. This figure doesn't include the shipping, but that's also something that we take into account. And I can show you here, this is a figure that my colleague produced as part of the ABC-iCAP project. The names are in the first slide. And he looked at the BC emissions across the Arctic countries. And you can see here that the BC emissions produce a huge, so the blue one is the BC emissions. And you can see that the climate-related impacts of shipping are extremely large. So they have extremely huge climate impacts in the Arctic regions. But of course, the source itself, BC source itself, is still relatively small for the region. So we're not able to isolate the health effects associated with BC. But in general, we see that the climate-related impacts are significant. You can see here that across these scenarios, so going back to total emissions, all emissions decrease. And particularly in the NFR STS scenario, which is the green dotted line at the bottom here, you can see huge reductions in BC, organic carbon, sulfur, and methane. So methane is also controlled in this scenario mainly because of the fossil fuel phase out. Okay, so this is how emissions reduce across the scenarios and what impacts do they have on health. And you can see here, these are some of the Arctic Observer and Arctic Council countries. And you can see here that already the CLE scenario leads to dramatic improvements in health in many parts of the world. So you can see here the CLE scenario has improvements in 2030 in the US, in Canada, and many places. But you still need further reductions of MFR scenarios, particularly for the Arctic Observer countries, where you can see that the MFR scenarios lead to huge reductions in 2030, for example. But these scenarios include, for example, also projection of demography. So these kind of scenarios cannot be calculated without also assuming population increases. And you can see that population increases, for example, in India, mean that even though we get reductions in 2030, we continue still to grow in mortality in 2050. So this is also something to keep in mind while estimating future emissions, that mortality changes can be quite dependent on assumptions you make on demography, on emissions, and of course on the health impacts. And here you can see that this is also a new slide. This is work that we're doing at the moment in the ABC-iCAP project. And we tried here to look at the costs and benefits. So we went beyond health and said, okay, you get these health reductions, you get these mortality reductions. What does that mean for costs and benefits? And the blue ones here show you the costs. You can see the blue side show you the costs, and the red and black on the right side show you the benefits. And you can see that I won't go into much detail, but the benefits by far exceed the costs in there. Benefits are, of course, based on a number of uncertainties again, and we are well aware of that. But in general, we think that the costs of producing fossil fuels and having ambitious air pollution policies will still be less than the benefits that you can get from this scenario. So key messages: strengthening air pollution legislations to the technically feasible level and phasing out fossil fuel use leads to a decrease in mortality by 35 to 50% in 2050 and a decline in morbidity. I didn't show the morbidity results here, but we also calculate morbidity impacts which are related, for example, to hospital admissions in the Arctic Council countries. The monetary related benefits in these countries are estimated at 250 to 750 billion euros in 2050. Again, a very uncertain number, and also needs to be adjusted, of course, for the GDP, which we have not done yet. And these benefits likely exceed the costs associated with these actions. What I didn't show here is the wildfire emissions. Wildfire emissions are also a huge source of BC in the Arctic region, and they are actually not included in our pollution control scenarios. But the wildfire emissions have a huge human component to them. A lot of the wildfires, yes, I don't know if you were there in previous presentations, a lot of the wildfires are produced by human activities. So it's necessary to also control for wildfire emissions in the Arctic. And of course, international shipping, which is growing and which at the moment we don't think has a huge share of the health benefits, but this could change given the expectation that the shipping industry is going to evolve and grow greatly in the region. Actions on reducing air pollution and fossil fuels. I said you need both. You need to take out fossil fuels, you need to reduce air pollution. And if you do both together, then of course you support everything from the European Green Deal, the revision of the EU air quality legislation, and of course the setting of zero objectives. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
The Arctic is our home. We call all this region Inuit, Nunat, our Inuit homeland. The ice is our highway. The Arctic Ocean and its coastal seas not only serve as highways for Inuit over the ice in winter and in the open water season, but are also essential for harvesting, culture, and livelihoods. Now, shipping is an integral part of the Inuit communities in all the circumpolar regions. The Inuit way of life is intricately tied to the Arctic ecosystem, Inuit culture. And when we say Inuit culture, I would really like to tie it in to our worldview, our knowledge system. Now, we have a term that we call sila that I would like to explain to you. Sila means the exterior, the weather outside. We can say, go check the weather outside, go check sila. What does it look like today? It can mean, you know, sila tsiagungitok, it's not good weather. Sila luttok, it's raining. But sila is also in our past former belief system, the greatest being, the one that has the greatest inua, the greatest spirit. So as we grow up and we gain sila, we learn about sila the most. And then we become sila tuyok, we become full of sila. That means wisdom. It means being wise. That means being respectful to others. respectful to our environment, respectful to animals around us, even though that we do depend on animals for our sustenance and for our lives, we still have respect for them. So a person who is sila tuyok is full of the exterior, has learned a great deal, and is wise. So I want to bring that up because that's why we are here, to protect our environment, because we have respect for it. So that leads us to how black carbon is damaging our environment. Now, it is a potent pollutant. It has been explained so well. It has a significant impact within Inuit Nunat, and it's not a theoretical issue for us. Inuit homeland is changing so rapidly right before our eyes. We didn't cause the climate crisis, but are the ones on the front lines dealing with the consequences. And black carbons will become even more urgent as shipping traffic increases further, with reports that Arctic sea ice is in decline and expected to result in ice-free summers by mid-21st century. Pollution from increased shipping in the Arctic is now visible and a direct threat to Inuit. And more needs to be done to develop clear, concrete, and effective next steps for mandating black carbon emission reductions at the international level. At the last IMO and Marine Environment Protection Committee meeting, ICC urged International Maritime Organization members to submit concrete proposals to PPR 11 to quickly mandate and eliminate black carbon emissions. As we heard, they can be eliminated immediately with immediate positive results. So it can be done. On a positive note, there are good steps being taken by countries like Canada and Norway on black carbon. Both of these countries are working on proposals to the IMO for Arctic emission control areas, ECA, as we call them. And Canada would substantially reduce black carbon emissions and have positive impacts on health and environment outcomes. What we like about these proposals is that they take into consideration Indigenous knowledge, our knowledge, and engaging Inuit communities about reducing black carbon in the shipping area. So what we also like is the fact that this community engagement also addresses reconciliation with Indigenous communities so that we take part in the proposal and that our concerns about any consequences that may appear out of implementing an ECA, that our issues are being taken into account. Another thing I'd like to say about that is that in this context, ICC would like to stress the need to have an accompanying equitable transition framework in place for measures like ECA or the investment in green shipping fuels to ensure that economic hardships don't occur, so that economic burden doesn't come to our communities. This point is so important because the rate of poverty, the cost of supplies that come into our communities is much higher, 2 to 3 times, 3 to 4 times higher than the rest of Canada or the rest of the United States. So that we are truly burdened. Our families also have lower income, family income, than the rest of Canadians or the rest of Southern communities. So when we want to go shopping for groceries at the store, the local store, we have to pay much higher price for a smaller amount of groceries that don't last very long in our homes. So the need for equitable transition We must take that into account. Lastly, what I'd like to mention to you is one of the solutions for helping find the answers to reducing black carbon, reducing underwater radiated noise, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, comes with our participation as Indigenous people, as Inuit. When we are at the table, our worldview, our perspectives, our knowledge, our sila dunak, our wisdom will be heard and taken into account. For instance, at the International Maritime Organization, where we now have provisional consultative status, and we're aiming for permanent consultative status. There will be a decision made in 2025 to see if we will gain permanent, to see whether the council at the IMO will allow us permanent consultative status. And we're working very hard to gain that so that we can be part of the table, so that sila tunak will be included in decisions. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you. So I would like to welcome our next speaker, Ludmila Osipova from the International Council on Clean Transportation, and Ludmila will join us online.
Hello everyone. I hope you can see my screen. I'll make it full screen and introduce myself. Could you confirm that you see the full screen?
Perfect, thank you.
Yes?
Yes, we can see you in full screen.
Great. Awesome, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Sorry I cannot join in person, but I'll try my best to present from here, from our office in Berlin. My name is Ludmila, and I'm a marine researcher at the International Council on Clean Transportation. And today I'm going to present our work that we've been doing at the ICCT already for the last 5-6 years on estimating what emissions are happening in the Arctic from the Arctic shipping, and looking at the trend in the Arctic to just keep our fingers on pulse of what's going on there. I would like to start, just like other presenters, explaining why black carbon in the Arctic matters. Well, first and foremost, black carbon is a very strong potent climate pollutant, and its global warming potential actually is 900 times stronger than of CO2 global warming potential. Sorry. So it's much stronger than CO2 emissions at 100 years timeline. But if we look at the 20 years timeline, which is makes more sense because black carbon actually is a short-lived climate, its global warming potential is even stronger. It's 3,200 times stronger. And also black carbon has a special effect in the Arctic because it reduces surface of albedo, or the snow and ice reflective power. That means that because black carbon has a black color, it absorbs more sun energy, and this exacerbates the melting of ice and snow in the Arctic. On top of it, black carbon has a negative health impact, and that was already covered by the previous speakers. Black carbon is a component of the particulate matters, and it can lead, it was shown to be a leading in cause of premature mortality in this area. One study showed that actually the black carbon combined with solid particles emitted above 40 degrees north accounted for more than 600 premature deaths only in 2012. And additionally, it can cause many respiratory issues, especially for vulnerable populations living in the Arctic area, cardiovascular issues. It increases risk of premature mortality, as I said, and also can increase inflammatory responses of the health. And finally, black carbon is a very overlooked pollutant. It's highly underregulated. There was a HFO ban introduced at the IMO, which will start in summer next year to be in power, but it only covers Arctic IMO definitions. And also there's a lot of exempts and waivers. And if they are all applied, we estimated that black carbon emission will be reduced by just 5%. And finally, the IMO and the European Union shipping policies, all the new shipping policies that are being introduced, do not really include a regulation for black carbon in any way. So first, I would like just to cover what is the Arctic. I already mentioned there is this IMO Arctic water as defined by the Polar Code. And on this map, you see it as a blue line. So this is basically the outline of the Arctic that is being regulated at the IMO. But we have actually a much broader scope of what Arctic is. The geographic Arctic extends at or above approximately 59 degrees to the north. And here, this purple color shows the entire Arctic area. There are two more definitions that I also put on this map just for the informative purposes. It's AMAP and AHDR boundaries that's shown in green and red colors, just to see how, just for you to understand how different the definitions of the Arctic is. So what do we know? What is our most recent discoveries about the shipping in the Arctic? We find out that in 2021, approximately 9,000 vessels have been identified in the geographic Arctic scope, and we estimated that there were 1.5 kiloton of black carbon emissions happening in this area. So if we look at the IMO Arctic water, the Polar Code definitions, this blue line that I mentioned before, you will see that it covers only 22% of these vessels and only 27% of black carbon emission, which is a strong indicator that we have to focus more on the geographic scope. We also find out that there is a surge in emissions from 2015. And in the plot shows that the main patterns remain the same, but the emissions are growing rapidly. And in this plot, you see that the emissions grew from 130 from heavy fuel oil to 267. So, and also same from all fuels. If you look, there is a more than 2 times growth in emissions. And most of these emissions are still coming from using residual fuels in the Arctic. However, the residuals is the still most common fuel, but switching from residual fuels to distillate doesn't require much work. It doesn't require engine modifications, and distillate fuels are available in any EU port. So if these ships that sailing in the Arctic switch to the distillates or use maybe LNG instead of residual fuels, like one of the ships that's shown in these maps, the black carbon emissions from these ships would fall dramatically. It would reach from 50 to 80% reduction. And this can be basically done overnight by just requiring ships switching from residuals to the distillates. So coming up to the conclusions of this sort of essence of what have been done in the last year, we find out that the IMO Polar Code covers only 22% of all vessels sailing in the Arctic and 27% of black carbon emissions in the geographic Arctics. And we also saw that black carbon emissions are growing and have doubled since 2015 up to 2021. And residual fuels remains the prevalent fuel in the Arctic. And we also can tell that current regulations are insufficient to reduce black carbon emissions in the Arctic. And by following that, we can give policy recommendations as following. We think that IMO and member states should limit exemptions and waivers for its Arctic HFO ban, so we could actually see the real effect of the HFO ban as soon as possible. We also believe that EU could require ships departing in its port use distillate fuel in the Arctic, and this way, this dramatic reduction of black carbon emissions could happen overnight. And finally, the short-lived climate pollutants like methane and especially black carbon should be integrated in the life cycle assessments of ship control measures at the IMO level and the EU level. Thank you for your time and for listening for this short presentation. If you have any questions, please reach me out. I'll be happy to answer those.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ludmila. And I'm now welcoming our next speaker and presenter, who is here with us, Elisama Meneses, from Say to No to LNG campaign.
Thank you, Elena. I think I will shake things a bit because I'm not going to be talking about black carbon. And speaking of shaking things a bit, let's shake a little bit as well. Maybe you put one hand up if you think climate change is bad. Another one if you think black carbon is worse in it. And clap if it just transition is what we need. There we go. Okay. So, thank you so much for having me here. I'm so honored to be part of this event. I look at all the speakers, Lisa and everyone else. I just feel very grateful to be part of this conversation. So what I'm going to be talking about is how methane is not a solution for black carbon. And my name is Elisama. Everyone calls me Ellie. And I'm part, can I have a... Does anyone have it? Yeah.
You can try the one which you change slides.
Yeah. Do you see it?
Yeah.
Isn't it that one? Oh, maybe.
Okay.
Thank you.
I wasn't very smart to make it pointed.
Thank you. So my name is Ellie, and in this event I'm representing the Say No Challenge campaign. This is a global campaign with organizations, including the CLIASP Alliance, all across the globe, including doctors who are increasing awareness of the impacts of methane for the environment and people. And the moment could not be as urgent to talk about it, because what we have been seeing in the last decade or so is an increase in LNG capable vessels. LNG stands for liquefied natural gas. This is basically old game, new name, old game. This is a fossil fuel that is just branded as something else that is nothing natural about it. And I hope by the end of my presentation, that's what you're gonna get. And one of the main issues in this increase of LNG vessels, not only the ones already in operation, but the ones on order being built right now, is methane. So depending on what you check or what study you're going to use, liquefied natural gas is between 85 and 98% methane. So actually, if we are calling liquefied natural gas what it is, we should call it liquefied methane gas, because that's exactly what LNG is. In methane, probably most of the people in the room know already about that, is a very strong greenhouse gas. So in the first 20 years after release, it has 80%, 80 times stronger, than CO2. So if you release methane right now and you measure in the next 20 years what it's doing 80 times more global warming than CO2. Methane is responsible for 25% of global warming. This is 1/4 of global warming just relying on one greenhouse gas. And even climate deniers in this COP28 have admitted that methane is a low-hanging fruit for climate action, meaning that if we only do one thing, in the next few years. And this one thing is making sure methane emissions are decreasing. We are good. We're going to be able to keep 1.5 Paris goal at reach. So the shipping sector is probably not living the same world that I just pictured to you right now, because what we have seen between 2012 and 2018 is a 150% increase in methane just from this sector. So when we compare in the same year the black carbon emission, and before we celebrate not seeing black carbon emission going up, just remember the previous presentation that black carbon emission can be 900 times more stronger than the CO2. So any black carbon is a problem. But what we try to see is that the solutions for black carbon emission, it's actually not a solution. It's just replacing black carbon for methane, because liquefied natural gas has been promoted by the same companies and industry from the oil and gas as the solution for black carbon. Well, by now, I hope you're probably already very familiarized with the problems of global warming in the Arctic. But in specific for methane, what I want to highlight is this study for the University of Cambridge. So these researchers, they looked at large stock of methane gas leaking from groundwater spring unveiled by melting glaciers. What that means is that when those stocks are exposed, they release methane that actually make it warmer and make more stock be exposed and release more methane. Are you following me? Which means that this loop will continue forever, and there will be a moment that even if you take away the LNG vessels, the system will continue because the loop is there. And this is part of one of the risks and impacts of methane, is the climate tipping point, especially in the Arctic, for all the reasons that Lisa and everyone else has talked about. We also don't know what we don't know. And there are mechanisms in that region that we need to approach from precautionary perspective. And one of those is the methane stocks in the area. So we need to stop methane so we can tackle global warming and make sure that this mechanism is not activated. Also, as you have heard from Lisa, there are many aspects of global warming, especially in the Arctic region with the rights of indigenous peoples. When we expand LNG, looking at the life cycle, what that means. You look at extraction of LNG, processing, transport, storage, and use. When you look at it, what you see is a path of human rights violations, financial losses, and health and environmental impacts. So LNG is associated with environmental racism. What we see is that racialized communities and low-income communities around LNG extraction areas, they have contaminated drinking water. The air is very polluted. Also, LNG, and there is a 10 years fight on the west coast of Canada with the Wet Sweat Nation, because the LNG facilities there and the natural gas pipelines, they are not coming with the free, prior, and informed consent from those communities. So these are all connected with the LNG and it's part of the LNG path. Not to mention the financial loss. So when you see the sector trying to move towards a zero emission future, what studies have shown is that LNG will be a 850 billion stranded asset. So meaning these vessels they're going to be useless, and we are just wasting money and lock in technology because we are not really talking about the real solutions. And as was mentioned from our first speaker, there are many health and environment impacts related to methane. I could see in her presentation lots of mention to it. And besides of what has been mentioned already, there is the consumption of billions of gallons of water associated with the LNG. There's impact in local farmers and agriculture. I mean, we're seeing, as Lisa mentioned already, food insecurity all across the globe, but especially in vulnerable communities, and what LNG and methane is doing is just exacerbating it. So to wrap up, I think the message here for today is to really get us to not buy into the false solution that LNG is fixing black carbon problem, and get more aware of the impacts of methane, not only in the Arctic, but in the global. You can find more about the campaign at sayno2lng.org, but the Clean Arctic Alliance also has a page on their website dedicated to talk about LNG in the Arctic. Thank you very much, and I will answer any questions later.
Thank you so much, Elisama. And now I'm pleased to invite our next speaker, Panganga Pangawui. Is it right? Almost right. Well, you tell me how it is right. And she will speak about marine geoengineering and that it's not a solution.
Yeah, great segue. Wanga atka banganga na nakapangawi, wanga ataka kanatrama naka Kirsten Nugak Pass, wanga si wungami, and my Ramka or my clan is Kiwagami. So as the global community increasingly acknowledges the climate crisis, there are desperate, harmful, counterintuitive measures being tested and promoted by billionaires in fossil fuel industry. One of these forms of false solutions to the climate crisis is called marine geoengineering. Marine geoengineering encompasses various proposed methods to supposedly mitigate climate change impacts on the oceans. These are greenwash techno fixes finding their way into policies and global platforms, many of which will be used in the carbon market and are used for so-called biodiversity offsets. Some of these methods include ocean fertilization, ocean alkalinity enhancement, hollow glass microspheres, and ice pumps powered by green hydrogen cells, as well as marine cloud brightening. Ocean fertilization involves adding nutrients to the ocean to stimulate phytoplankton growth, which will supposedly sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. However, this approach raises concerns about its impact on marine ecosystems, including potential for harmful algal blooms. For instance, when this was done in 2018, in 2017, the rate of toxic algal blooms in Alaska increased in 2018 when there was an experiment in the Arctic. Ocean alkalinity enhancement aims to increase the ocean's capacity to absorb and store carbon dioxide by adding alkaline substances such as calcium hydroxide or limestone. While this method supposedly offers potential benefits for carbon sequestration, the long-term environmental consequences and ethical considerations, particularly regarding Indigenous peoples and local communities, are not being evaluated. Hollow glass microspheres are proposed to increase the surface albedo of ice, reflecting more sunlight and reducing the absorption of heat. One such experiment was done in Koperqualuk without the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. And the plan of the Arctic Ice Project was to spread 100,000 square kilometers annually across the Arctic ice. And this would cost between $1 and $5 billion, depending on what method they used. And of course, the Indigenous communities, we were not informed, consulted, and when we actually tried to engage, we were turned away at their event. So there's a deliberate exclusion of Indigenous voices when it comes to a lot of these technologies. Another experiment that happened in Nome was an ice pump that's supposed to take ocean water from underneath the ice and spill it over the top to try to thicken it. The website of this geoengineering project touts that Indigenous peoples will benefit and run these technologies, and yet they did not engage with any Indigenous peoples. And they came to Nome, did their experiment, and just left. So there are a lot of consequences with each of these, mainly to do with the ecosystems, and I'll talk about that more broadly in a little bit. Marine cloud brightening encompasses the use of nanoparticles typically created from seawater sprayed into the air to increase the albedo of clouds. This technology at scale would disrupt monsoon cycles, increase marine traffic, and disrupt the marine ecosystem. Apart from the debate about these technologies that simply tries to focus on the potential pros and cons of the technologies, each of these has several common underlying themes. They are billionaire and fossil fuel backed. They are theoretical and risky. They will cost enormous amounts of resources and would require multi-decade international agreements. They require the continued use of indigenous lands and waters as sacrifice zones, as we have seen in the resource development that has gotten us into the climate crisis to begin with. Already these technologies are being tested on us without our free, prior, and informed consent. As an Indigenous person deeply connected to the land, I must emphasize the peril of excluding Indigenous perspectives when devising solutions to address climate change. Our close relationship with the ecosystems being experimented on is integral to our understanding of their intricate balance and delicate harmony. Those conducting these experiments often lack familiarity with our ecosystems, and their methods of testing and inquiry fall short of comprehensiveness. Their questions are often one-dimensional, failing to consider the necessity for nature to have the time to adapt to a rapidly changing climate. Further human intervention through geoengineering would disrupt the natural adaptive processes of our ecosystems. The urgency of the climate crisis demands that we consider the long-term consequences of our actions. It is essential to recognize that the wisdom embedded in Indigenous knowledge systems is rooted in the deep observation and understanding of our environment over generations. Our traditional Indigenous knowledge offers insights into the resilience and adaptability of our ecosystems, emphasizing the need for a cautious and holistic approach to environmental stewardship. We are in a climate crisis because of a flawed value system that allows for the sacrifice of many and the supposed benefit of a few. Geoengineering is a concept that continues that practice. Resource development and geoengineering are both forms of commodification of nature and wrongly views humans as separate from nature. Our communities, intimately tied to the land and water, bear witness to the interconnectedness of all life and the necessity of preserving the integrity of our ecosystems. In light of these considerations, it is imperative that decision makers and researchers engaged in genuine dialogue with Indigenous peoples, recognizing the invaluable wisdom that we possess. Our voices hold the key to a more comprehensive understanding of the complex web of relationships within ecosystems and the consequences of large-scale interventions. Let us strive for a future where Indigenous perspectives are not only included, but honored as essential contributions to the collective efforts to address climate change. Only through genuine collaboration and respect for Indigenous knowledge can we hope to navigate the changes ahead with the wisdom and foresight that we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Panganga. And now I'm pleased to invite our next and last speaker for today, and she will join us remotely. It's Dr. Sean Pryor, based in London, and she will speak about options for the rapid reductions of black carbon emissions.
Thank you, Elena, and hello to everyone. I'm sorry that I can't be there with you in Dubai, but I'm very happy to be able to join remotely. And although I'm based in the UK, we're having some issues at home with our boiler system, and so I have no heating. So it's feeling a little bit, not quite like the Arctic, but maybe approaching Arctic conditions here at the moment. As Elena said, I'm Sean Pryor, the lead advisor to the Clean Arctic Alliance, which is a coalition of 22 non-profit organizations campaigning for the protection of the Arctic from the impact of shipping activities. And our foremost campaign addresses emissions of black carbon from shipping that is having an impact in the Arctic. And following Panganga's presentation, I'm going to talk now a little bit about how shipping can reduce its climate impact so that we are not in a position where we're trying to rely on other ways of addressing the climate emergency that we face. It's now over 16 years since a paper recognizing that black carbon is a potent climate forcer was submitted to the International Maritime Organization's Marine Environmental Protection Committee. Following that first paper in 2007, in 2010, 3 member states, Norway, Sweden, and the United States, proposed that the IMO address the issue of black carbon by examining measures which would significantly reduce emissions from shipping having an impact in the Arctic. At that time, it was envisaged that the reductions of black carbon could provide a short-term climate response that was considered to be absolutely necessary to forestall a climate tipping point, and could provide breathing time for the needed reductions in CO2 to take hold over the longer term. Unfortunately, the work has taken so long that I think we've now lost that breathing time, and we now need immediate action as well as action to reduce longer term the impacts of longer term climate emissions. In 2010, when the work started, the IMO agreed a 3-step approach to address ship-source black carbon emissions that have an impact in the Arctic. The first step was to define black carbon, and although this took much debate, eventually it was settled as there was settlement on a widely accepted definition of black carbon. The second step was to agree how best to measure black carbon emissions, and this has resulted in 3 principal methods being identified. And the third step was to address the control of black carbon emissions, but this work remains ongoing. Some guidance is under discussion at the moment and hopefully should be finalized in the coming year, but actual regulation is still some way off. In 2011, the UN Economic Commission for Europe, administering the Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution, submitted a paper which urged the IMO to take active steps to improve public health, particularly for indigenous Arctic populations, and to slow the rate of warming. It recognized that action could be performance-based, requiring a specific emission reduction, or technology-based, such as requiring the use of low-sulfur fuels and diesel particulate filters when operating in the Arctic. So 12 years ago, we knew what needed to be done. Now, I know we started a bit late, but time's moving on. So what I'm going to do is actually just skip the next short part of my presentation. Some of it has been covered already anyway. So I'm going to go straight into what the options are for reducing black carbon emissions from shipping that have an impact in the Arctic. I think it was Lisa who mentioned that earlier this year, there was a clear call at the IMO issued to its members to bring forward concrete abatement proposals for consideration when the Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee, that's the technical committee responsible for this work, next meets, which is in February next year. It's now fairly well understood that limiting the aromatic hydrocarbon content of fossil fuels is key to reducing black carbon emissions. And importantly, the hydrogen to carbon ratio, or HC ratio, of these fuels is the best indicator of whether a fuel is aromatic or paraffinic. Limits on the aromatic content of fuels for road use, off-road, and diesel-powered locomotives, as well as inland shipping fuels, have been applied in both Europe and North America for over a decade. So we've known for quite some time that it's the aromatic content of fuels, oil-based fuels, that is responsible for the higher emissions of black carbon. And in 2018, an update of an earlier IMO study stressed that the fastest option by far, and of particular relevance for shipping's black carbon impact on the Arctic, would be an immediate shift to distillate fuels. The Clean Arctic Alliance has identified 3 measures which we believe should be pursued as a high priority. And this is come about as a result of a number of years of discussion within the IMO, within correspondence groups and working groups, of a long list of around 40 different types of measures that could lead to black carbon emissions reductions. And we're focusing really on 3 measures now, and I'm just going to go through each of them individually. But these could all work together in a stepped approach, or they could be taken forward individually. The first measure is a switch to distillate approach, as recommended in the earlier study and also identified by the paper some years ago, 10 years or more ago now, from the UN Air Convention. And this is a simple change in fuel choice, which has been on the table, as I say, for over 12 years. It is already encouraged on a voluntary basis through an IMO resolution, and it is undoubtedly the simplest and quickest way in which black carbon emissions in and near to the Arctic can be reduced. It would see between a 50 to 80% reduction in black carbon emissions, and the range depends on the engine in use, the age, maintenance of the engine, and the load of the ship. So there are some variations, but 50 to 80% reduction in black carbon by each ship individually. Ships already switch backwards and forwards between heavier fuels and distillate as they operate in and out of emission control areas. So we know switching to these lighter fuels is feasible. And the use of lighter distillate fuels would also facilitate the installation of diesel particulate filters, which would reduce emissions of black carbon by over 90% and have been used in land-based transport for a long time. It would be important that such a measure could be applied over a suitable geographic area. And as Ludmila was talking about, we would argue that that needs to be in the whole area north of 60 degrees north. And such a measure could be included as a new regulation within the IMO's MARPOL Convention, and specifically in Annex 6, which addresses air emissions. This really is low-hanging fruit. It could be done very, very easily, very, very quickly, and no new fuels are required. The second regulatory control measure would be a polar aromatic fuel standard. And this could also be introduced via an addition of a new regulation to MARPOL, and it could work in conjunction with the switch to distillate. A benefit of this approach is that the measure would be goal-based, and that means that ship operators could determine how best to comply with the regulation. So it wouldn't be prescriptive. It would be necessary to know the aromatic content of marine fuels, preferably by testing for the HC, hydrogen-carbon ratio, and it would also be necessary to establish a maximum black carbon threshold. And that means that all the fuels that were then used by shipping in the Arctic would need to comply with a specific HC ratio standard. Initially, the threshold could be set based on the average performance of existing distillate fuels, but tightened over time, since ultimately the threshold needs to be 0 black carbon emissions. The geographic scope of the regulation would also need to be determined appropriately. And then the third measure, which we believe could be complementary, would be the development of a black carbon emission control area designation. We already have emission control areas to limit the amount of SOx and NOx being emitted by ships. And we would argue that a complementary emission control area to address black carbon would be valuable. This measure would also require a black carbon threshold to be introduced via a new regulation in the MARPOL Convention. And the benefits would be that a BC-iCAP, or Black Carbon Emission Control Area regulation, could be developed by an individual country or a group of countries working collaboratively to bring in tighter standards in a given area. There would be no need in the case of an ECA to define the geographic scope of the measure. That would be done automatically by the countries introducing the measure. And the designation could also be used further afield to support reductions in black carbon emissions arising from further south. So it could, as I say, be complementary to an aromatic fuel standard, provided it required a tougher threshold than that was agreed for the fuel standard. Yeah, as we've heard today, the Arctic serves as a regulator of global climate and other ecological processes through large-scale patterns related to air and ocean circulation. And the changes that we're seeing in the Arctic are impacting and will continue to impact the rest of the world. It really is a travesty that amid the clear and unfolding climate crisis in the Arctic, that emissions of a potent, short-lived climate pollutant remain totally unregulated, especially when potential solutions for Arctic shipping already exist. If we are to achieve the necessary rapid, deep, and sustained mitigation that is called for in the latest IPCC reports, then in the short term, there is an urgent need for measures that will reduce short-lived climate pollutants immediately. And we believe that the options that I've just laid out can do just that for the shipping sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. And before I actually wrap up this session, I would like to invite to say a few words a representative of the IMO, International Maritime Organization, the Secretariat, Mr. Camille Bourgeon, who just actually came to our session, I guess, on his own accord. It's quite serendipitous because he represents the International Maritime Organization, is a key regulatory framework for us to have all those measures that Sean was talking about. And so that would be really, we will be really honored if Mr. Camille just say a few words to us on behalf of the IMO. Yes, please.
Well, thank you very much. Good day to all. So yeah, indeed, I came a bit in an impromptu manner, but thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you also to the Inuit Circumpolar Council for your contribution to IMO's work. I think it's important to acknowledge the efforts you put into supporting the work. IMO is a technical agency of the United Nations. It deals with shipping. It's Transport Day today, and I think we've heard several times how shipping is important in also supporting the livelihoods of communities across the world. I'm here to attend COP mostly to also talk about achievements and the current work at the IMO and within the maritime industry on greenhouse gas emissions from ships. And indeed, our member states adopted a strategy in July. I don't know if you're aware, but which really significantly strengthened the ambition for this sector to keep 1.5 degrees alive. And now they are embarked into developing the measures that will actually drive the change in the sector. You are IMO, and this is sort of the message I wanted to say, because I represent the Secretariat, but IMO is made of its 175 member states, almost 100 observer organizations, and one of the specificities of IMO is that we develop mandatory rules. And it's one of the very few UN organizations that actually develop mandatory rules. So as you can imagine, it takes the need for long discussions and evidence-based discussion to get to an agreement among the member states on what regulatory framework should apply to shipping. The good news is that there's really a full commitment of the member states to achieve our net zero target in shipping. Black carbon is also an important aspect, and I really encourage all of you to follow what's happening. I know that Lisa and I will see each other, Sienna as well, in February for the Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee to consider some of the very concrete proposals that have been put on the table that has been mentioned. We've received a proposal by Canada for an Arctic AMAP, so this will be considered. And there are also a number of other proposals that are on the table. So happy to, I have to go, unfortunately, quickly after the meeting, but thank you again. I learned a lot. It was very interesting, and continue your efforts and your work. Thank you.
Okay, well, on this note, I would like to thank you, everyone who was here today in the audience. I would like also to thank our lovely speakers, Shilpa, Lisa, Ludmila, Elissima, Panganga, Sean, our distinguished guest from the IMO, Camille. I would like to also thank the Cryosphere Pavilion for inviting the Clean Arctic Alliance to organize this event today. And finally, I would like to also thank you all who is watching us right now on the live stream. I would like to actually finish by reflecting to the words of Hans Otto Fortner, one of the co-chairs of the IPCC report addressing impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, which contributed to the sixth assessment of the IPCC. He said, the scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delays in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. I believe that this word should be at the heart, in the hearts and the minds of everyone for all further and current discussions in the IMO, in all other relevant venues and places. Thank you so much for being here with us today.